Today we're going to learn how to make every lonely developer's favorite UI interaction, Tinder style swipe cards. We're going to use React, FramerMotion, and a bit of TailwindCSS and TypeScript, though the last two are definitely not required. And let's jump right into the code. Wait, actually one more thing. I'm finally working on a React animation course. If you've ever wanted to be able to build any UI animation that you can dream up in React, you'll get a discount on that when it's done by joining the waitlist below. And okay, now onto the code. Okay, so we've got a little bit of stuff already set up here, nothing too crazy. We can go over it really quick. So I just have this basic little component here, and I've really just styled the background for this. So this component has a min height of screen, and then just this neutral 100 background color, which if you're using CSS is just 245, 245, 245. And then I have this little inline background image thing that just makes up this little checkerboard thing in the background. That's just to make it look a little bit better. You definitely don't need this, but if you want it, you can totally grab it from the source code in the description. Now for my cards, I'm just planning on having an image. Obviously you can style these up however you want, but given I just need an image, I'm gonna just go ahead and drop some data down here for all of our different cards, just so we can kind of get these laid out. So all that each of my cards are going to have is just an ID and a URL. That's just like the href to the image. And then the IDs I just have as integers like this, and these are just unsplash images. So nothing crazy there. You can totally just go and grab whatever unsplash images you want, or just, again, grab these from my source code if you just want to use the same ones. Now I'd like to start by just getting some content on the screen. So up here in my div, we can start by just mapping over our card data. So for each one of our cards, I just want to return a component, which I'm going to call card. That's going to need a key. So we can just say card.id. And we can go ahead and create that component down here really quick so this stops yelling at us. Let's say const card. And again, this is going to just return an image for my case. So we can just say image like this. This is going to need to take in both this ID and this URL. So we can just start with those. So we can say ID URL. And then of course we need to make sure, since I'm using TypeScript, that we type these out. So this will be a number and the URL will be a string. We can pass these into our component just by spreading in all of our card data like this, and then making sure that we actually set all this up. So we can just say source is equal to URL. And for an alt, I'm just going to add whatever placeholder so it doesn't yell at me, but add your own alts and pass those in if you're doing the same thing as me if you want. And if we save that, this is obviously going to look really stupid right now because we still need some extra styling. First and foremost, let's just give these all kind of a basic size. So I'm going to give mine a height of 96, which if I hover over that is 24 rem or 384 pixels. I'm just kind of making these numbers up. So we'll say width 72, and that's 288 pixels. Saving that, we should now have something that looks like this, which they're all a little bit distorted, and we can fix that by saying object cover. In CSS, that's just object fit cover. And that should get rid of all of our distortion and just make the image kind of fit over the space given. And then maybe we'll give this a little bit of border radius. So I'll just say rounded LG or 8 pixels. And I think that is okay for the styling for now. Now I want all of these obviously to kind of stack right on top of each other, right in the middle of the screen. And there's a little bit of a trick that you can use using CSS grid to do that without having to do absolute positioning and transforms and stuff like that, which is especially useful in this case because I'm going to need to be able to change the X transform on this image whenever we're dragging it in a minute. And it gets a little bit more complicated if you do kind of that absolute positioning trick. So grid kind of helps us here. And to do that, all we really need to do is on our wrapping div up here, give this a display of grid like that, and then give this a place items of center just like this. And now down on our cards, we can actually just directly define which row and column we want them in, and those can all be the same, which will just stack them all on top of each other. So I can just do an inline style like this and say grid row 1, grid column 1, and now they should all stack right on top of each other like this. Obviously you can't tell because they're all the same size, but that is now what's happening. Now to just actually start jumping into the animation, the first thing that we can do, this will actually let us see that we're correctly stacking everything on top of each other, is just make this image draggable. So to do that, I'm going to come up to the top, and I've already got FramerMotion imported, so I can import motion from FramerMotion like this. So again, if you haven't already installed this, make sure FramerMotion is installed. And what we can now do is come down to our image right here and turn this into a motion.div. So any of your just base HTML or JSX elements in this case can be prepended with motion. And this gives us access to a bunch of different props that we can use to declaratively define our animations. For drag animations, this is as simple as just adding a drag prop like this. And I only want to be able to drag this in the X axis. So I can just say drag X. And now I can come over here and I can start dragging my elements around. Now, if I let these go, I can even kind of throw them or throw this one like this. And that's not necessarily what we want. We probably want this to actually be constrained to the center of this. So if I drag it just a little bit, I probably want it to pop back to the middle. And we do that using one of these other props. So I'm going to go ahead and say drag constraints. You can play with all of these if you want to kind of fine tune this. But just to kind of make sure everything sticks to the center, I'll say drag constraints. And then on both left and right, I'm just going to put these straight at 0. So essentially this is saying I can't drag it at all to the left or to the right. Or more specifically, I can drag it in these directions because it has some elasticity to it. But when I let it go, it will make sure it pops right back into the center. To demonstrate that, I can grab this right here and pull it over. And we'll see it has a little bit of kind of stretchiness to it now. You can also kind of dial that in if you want. But now if I let this go, it'll just pop it right back to the center, which I think looks really good. Now, before we dial in the rest of these animations, one extra little CSS thing that I want to do here is add some different cursors whenever you're hover or grabbing this, just to make it a little bit more obvious. So I'm saying hover. Whenever I'm hovering over this element, I want to change cursor to grab. And whenever it's active or whenever my mouse is down, I want to change cursor to grabbing. So if you haven't seen those, that just means whenever I hover over it, it's going to give me this cursor. And then when I click down, it's going to give me this cursor just like that. Just a little bit of a housekeeping thing there, but that should work for now. And now with all of that, we can finally get to putting the actual interaction piece of this together. Now, all of this interaction is really going to be based off of something called motion values and how Framer Motion tracks the state of animations internally, right? So you can think about the fact that we just had to add this drag X here, and that immediately kind of started allowing us to drag everything back and forth. Under the hood, obviously there's some kind of transform, translate thing happening here. We just don't really have any direct access to it or direct knowledge of it. All we had to do is just flip this one little switch. But under the hood, that actually is still happening. And we're going to need some way to actually track that value, because as we drag this over, we're going to want to maybe rotate it or change its opacity. And then eventually, if you drag it past some certain point, we're going to want to just completely get rid of that card and then bring the next card forward. So the way that we actually track that value is by using a hook. Let me kind of fold this up here, up from Framer Motion, called use motion value. And use motion value is kind of like use state in a way. So I can say const X. So X is kind of the value that I want to track here, my X transform. In Framer Motion, that's a shorthand, but under the hood, obviously, again, it's doing a transform translate X. And I'll just set that equal to this use motion value hook like this, which is just going to default to 0. And now in my style tag, I can just pass in X right here. And we can actually log this value out. You know, if you just tried to do something like a use effect, maybe like you would with a normal piece of state, and then add X and then do a console log X like this, that's actually not going to work here, because X, this value changing, does not actually cause a re-render of this whole component. It just changes this one component. So in order to actually listen to the changes of this value, the easiest way is using the use motion value event hook, which is going to look something like this. So kind of like a use effect, just directly call use motion value event, pass in our X here, and then we want to listen for the change event. This will then give us the latest value, which we can then just console.log latest. And if I open up my console here, clear these out, give it a little bit more room. Now, as I start to drag this element, we should start getting logs, right? So as I drag it over to the left, we get negative logs. To the right, we get positive logs. And this means that we can do whatever we want with this value. We shouldn't actually need this log anymore. So I'm gonna get rid of that and close this up like this. And we can start with just some basic kind of value changes as we go back and forth, just to kind of see how this is going to work. So for instance, maybe we want to change the opacity of this. Well, opacity is just going to be a value from 0 to 1. So 0 opacity, 1 or 100% opacity. So we need to be able to actually transform this value into a value that will map to opacity. And the way that we use that is by using another React hook called use transform. And the shape of this is going to look something like the following. So we'll just define our value, say const opacity, set that equal to use transform. This is going to start by taking in a motion value. So in this case, our X right here. And then the first array is essentially a map of values that we want to map from. And then the second array is values that we want to map to. So by that, I mean, whenever we're at, say, minus 150 pixels to 150 pixels, and then in the middle is 0. We want to then map that to a set of opacity. So at, say, minus 150, we want to be at 0 opacity. At 0, we want to be at full opacity. And then the same with 150, we want to be at 0 or something like this. So 0, 1, 0. And now we can just take this motion value and pass that directly into our style tag like this. And from here, whenever we start dragging our element, we'll now see that it actually has this opacity fade going all the way to 0 once it's dragged all the way over to the side. We can do the same thing for, say, rotate. So let's try that. We'll say rotate. And we don't actually need 3 values for this because we're just going to say minus 150 to 150. And we'll go from, I think I did minus 18 to 18 last time. And same thing, we can just go ahead and drop this in like here. And now as I drag it over, it will actually start doing this transform, which is exactly what we're looking for. Now this rotate piece is going to get a little bit more complicated as we go, but before I actually get to that and doing kind of the final polish, I would like to just kind of finish off the piece of actually getting this to dismiss whenever you drag it all the way to the side. So we're going to do that first, and then we're going to circle back afterwards, and we'll actually polish this up and make it look really nice and add a bunch of, cool extra little things to it. So how I'm going to want this to work is I'm going to want to dismiss this if you drug to one side or the other greater than, say, let's go with 50 pixels. So if I just drag it just a tiny little bit, I don't want to actually dismiss. Only after 50 pixels, which maybe that's something like that, do I actually want this to dismiss. And I also only want this to happen once you've actually let your mouse up. Like I don't want it to just go away out from under you. You could totally do this different, but for my example, that's how I'm going to do it. And I'm going to start by just creating a new function right here that I'm going to call handle drag end. As you can tell from the name, this is a function that's going to be called on drag end. So I'm going to come down here to the bottom. We'll say on drag end, and then pass in our function here. And then all that we need to do is actually check the value of x right here. Now it's not just going to be something like if, x is greater than 50, then kind of do some stuff. That's because x, remember, is a motion value, not just an absolute value. So if we want to get the absolute value, we need to do x.get, and that will actually give us the number. And more importantly, this can also be a negative number. So what I'm actually going to say is math.abs to get the absolute value. So the absolute value, which could either be, negative 150 to 150 or whatever. If both of these are the case, then we want to get rid of front card. Now, in order to do that, obviously, we're going to need to store our state somewhere so then we can kind of filter it out. Right now, we just have our list of card data down here that we're kind of mapping over. So instead of using it from there, I'm actually going to drop this in a piece of state just using a normal React use state. So cards, set cards, pass in our card data, make sure that we're mapping over these cards instead of the default cards right here. And then I'm just going to pass both of these values down through my cards. So right down here on my card components, make sure we're actually passing both of these down. We're going to use cards as well here in a second. Make sure we're then destructuring these right here like this in our actual card component. And if you are using TypeScript, then you can add the types for this as well, which are just going to look like this. And now I need to remember to import these types. There we go. And now all that we need to do is actually filter out our list of cards to make sure that whichever card with the given ID for this card, just said card a lot, but whatever has the ID for this exact component actually gets filtered out of the list. And that will look something like this. So set cards. I'll just do the inline function version of this. So previous value, then we'll say previous value.filter. And we want to filter this down to value.id is not equal to the given ID. And we should now be able to dismiss our cards. So drag it over just a little bit, doesn't go away. Only after 50 pixels, let go. Now it goes away and I get my next card, and then I can kind of just keep doing this. So at this point, this obviously works. This may be good enough for whatever your use case is, but I'd like to make this look a little bit better and kind of clean up a couple of the little rough spots here. And we're going to start doing that by rotating, not just by drag, but I would like to also rotate the cards in the back to actually make sure that you can kind of see that there's stuff behind this front card to actually denote that there's an interaction to be done here. Now, the way that we're going to do that is as opposed to just directly dropping in our rotate like this, I want to take in a couple of different parameters for how we define this. One of those is going to be our drag value right here, but that's kind of going to be added to another value that we're going to define based on the position of this card in the stack. Now, use transform actually has two different ways it can be used. So I'm going to first change my rotate here to say rotate raw, and then I'm going to define a new value, also called rotate. That is going to call use transform. Use transform can actually take a function as opposed to a mapping like this. And this just needs to return some value. So if we just did like rotate raw.get, this will actually continue to work exactly the same way. But now inside of this function, we can do whatever we want to this value. First of all, I don't actually want to rotate the front card. So I'm going to define right above this another value that I'm going to say const is front. I'm going to set that equal to a value that looks like this. So if the ID is equal to the last card in the stack, now I'm saying last card, so you might not have noticed this yet, but we're actually stacking from back to front with how this is set up right now. And that is just because of the way that we're doing this kind of grid place item center thing and how Z indexes are stacking up. You can change that in other ways if you want, but I'm just dealing with it as it is. So essentially we just need to say if there's the last card in our array, then that means it's the front one. So we'll say is front is equal to ID is equal to cards at cards dot length -1 dot ID. And this is actually how we can figure out if a card is the front card. And then we can actually figure out like an additional offset to add to this rotate value. So I'll define that as offset. And then we'll say if this is the front card, then we'll define it as 0. Remember that our IDs, how I set this up, are just auto incrementing integers. So I can say if my ID modded by 2, then we'll say maybe 6 degrees, else -6 degrees. And then we can just add these two values together to get our full offset. And I'll clean that up by defining this as degrees. And now we should kind of have our full thing here, right? So we can now see that all of our elements in the background are being rotated. I don't necessarily love that all of these are rotating from the center. I would actually rather them rotate from the bottom. And we can do that by saying origin bottom or transform origin bottom like this. And that will actually stack our cards so they're kind of splaying out from the sides, which I just think looks a little bit better. And this should still continue to work. So as I drag everything, they kind of pop into place. One thing you may have just noticed though, is that as I kind of let go of this element, the next one doesn't actually animate back into place, right? So this one gets dismissed and then the next one just kind of pops right into place. So doing that one more time. As I get rid of this element, the next one just pops into place. Now this comes from the fact that we are passing in our rotate to style. There is an animate prop that you can pass to frame or motion, which will automatically animate between values, but you actually can't use these direct motion values directly in the animate prop. So my little basic workaround for that, now there's more complicated workarounds for this, but this is what I find to be easiest, is just actually defining a transition. So I'll say transition, and I want to say maybe 0.125 seconds on the transform property. This could be a little bit of an anti-pattern, but I've never really ran into any issues with it. And now we should see that after we dismiss one card, the next one animates into place, and that looks a little bit better. Now, just kind of as a final cleanup for this, I'm just gonna add a couple of extra little styles here. I'm gonna refresh my screen so that I get all of my cards back. And all of those are just gonna be based on this is front prop right here. So for instance, if my card is in the front, I would like to add some box shadow. So if it's in front, then I'm gonna add this box shadow that I've added right here. I just took this from, I think, the frame remote or from the TailwindCSS shadow LG. And speaking again about that animate prop, I can come in here and just drop animate in. I guess technically as I have this set up, I could also drop it into style because I have this transition on transform, but I'll leave it like this since it's already how I already had it set up. This way the back cards are being scaled a little bit down and it'll give them both a rotation and a scale whenever they come back up to the front. And really with all of that, this should be our final animation. So I have my cards right here, drag it just a little bit, doesn't go anywhere. As soon as I drag it all the way out here and let go, the next one kind of pops up off of the stack, both with the scale and a rotate. All of this code is available on my website in both JavaScript and in TypeScript, along with a bunch of other cool animations and interactions, both built in React and Frame or Motion, all with Tailwind CSS. You can go ahead and play around with those. I'll also mention again that I do have that course, and if that's something you're interested in, I have a waitlist in the description. That should be out in the next couple of months. I don't have a definitive timeline yet. I'm probably halfway through writing the code for it, then I need to film it, but I'm squeezing all of the information that I know about building animations into that course. So if that's something you're interested in, I think it'll be a really valuable resource. Beyond that, if you got anything out of the video, I would massively appreciate a like and a subscribe. And anyways, I will see you guys next time. Peace.